This podcast contains explicit language. Listener discretion is advised. The following program presents an examination of a criminal investigation. Any individual who may have been investigated or faces criminal charges continues to be considered innocent until proven guilty.
911, what's your emergency? My granddaughter has been taken. She has been missing for a month.
Her head is bleeding severely. We need an ambulance.
This is Marcia Clark Investigates the First 48, the podcast. I'm Marcia Clark. On my A&E show, Marcia Clark Investigates the First 48, we investigated the Billionaire Boys Club murders. The Billionaire Boys Club was a cult-like investment and social club led by Joe Hunt, a cunning and charismatic young man who believed the ends justified the means. The BBC's investments went bust, and they wound up hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt. Desperate to dig themselves out of the hole, they turned to murder, or rather, two murders. The body of one of the victims was never found. And as for the second victim, no one was ever convicted of murder. I wanted to investigate these murders to determine whether anyone can ever be brought to justice. Now let's get to the facts of the case. Since Joe Hunt is the driving force in this story, I'm going to start by telling you a little bit about him. He was born Joseph Henry Gamsky to a family of modest means. When the family moved to LA, Joe won a scholarship to the prestigious prep school, Harvard School, which is now called Harvard Westlake. Joe's classmates came from some of the richest, most powerful families in Beverly Hills, and Joe desperately wanted to be accepted. But the other boys had been raised in a life of privilege. Compared to them, Joe was uncool, rough around the edges. And although he'd snagged a scholarship, he wasn't a great student. And his true colors were actually already starting to show. Joe was passionate about debate, and he joined the school debating team, but he was ultimately kicked off for falsifying evidence during a competition. It was an early harbinger of things to come, an early sign of his win-at-all-cost philosophy that he'd later bring to the Billionaire Boys Club. After graduating prep school, Joe went to USC, where he studied accounting. And he actually passed the CPA exam, and I've heard he did it when he was just 19 years old. Quite an achievement by any measure. But he was anxious to get out into the world and start making money, so he dropped out during his sophomore year and moved to Chicago. There, Joe joined the Chicago Mercantile Exchange as a floor trader. He ran an investment group, though he didn't have a license. It didn't go well. Joe wasn't great at the investment game, and he ultimately got caught trading investors' money as his own. That got him a 10-year suspension from the exchange. He went back to Los Angeles and reconnected with his wealthy classmates at Harvard. It was then that he formed the investment club that would later be known as the Billionaire Boys Club, or the BBC, which is how I'll refer to it from now on. Joe started the enterprise by persuading his young classmates to get their families to invest in the club. His first two recruits were Dean Carney, who was Joe's closest friend, and Ben Dosty. Joe had a Svengali-like influence over the young club members, and he preached his belief system, which he called the paradox philosophy. It was basically just a retread of the Machiavellian theory that the ends justify the means. At first, the club made money trading in high-risk commodities, but the money flowed out faster than it came in as Joe and his club members spent large on the high life, a suite of fancy offices, luxury cars, designer clothes, and expensive nights out. In an effort to bring in more money, Joe made ever riskier investments in the market, and it wasn't long before he found himself in over his head. As his investments failed, he turned the club into a Ponzi scheme, using money from new investors to pay out the old investors. But this obviously couldn't go on forever. The new investors wanted to see a return on their money too. Pressure was mounting on them to deliver. They needed cash, and fast. Almost on cue, Joe heard about a wealthy Beverly Hills businessman named Ron Levin. Joe set his sights on meeting him.
And the whole city police department knew Ron Levin.
Joining us on the show today is former Beverly Hills Police Detective Les Zoller, lead detective on the Billionaire Boys Club case. He is joining us from an undisclosed remote location, so we're going to sound a little bit different.
He was very well known, so...
What was he like? Can you describe him?
I hate to say it, but he was a lot like Joe Hunt. And he was a very, very bright individual. He was self-assured. He liked to be the center of attention. He was just one of those guys.
Now, Ron Levin was a flashy man about town in his 40s with a hip, expensive style. He billed himself as a successful entrepreneur, but in reality, he was a con man who made his money by pulling off a variety of fraudulent schemes. And to those on the outside, even though they knew he was a con artist, he appeared to be highly successful. When Joe Hunt heard about the seemingly wealthy Levin, he found a way to meet him. Ron Levin would be the answer to all his problems. With no time to lose, Joe immediately began to work on getting Ron Levin to invest in the BBC. Levin eventually agreed. He gave Joe $5 million to trade in a brokerage firm where Levin had an account. He promised Joe they'd split the profits. Over the next few months, Joe had actually done quite well. He turned that $5 million into almost $14 million. Finally, Joe had found the score that would not only bail the BBC out of debt, it had put them in the black.
Now, the broker said these trades were so outlandish that I wouldn't normally allow it to happen, except that he knew it was a fake account.
Levin was actually scamming Joe. Levin had told the brokerage firm that he was a documentary filmmaker working on a movie about trading commodities. He proposed setting up a fake account that appeared to have $5 million, but it had no real money in it. He'd have Joe invest the money in the account and tell Joe that the account was real, so Joe would believe real money was on the line. But now you're probably wondering, what's in it for Ron Levin? Plenty. More on that after the break. I'm a firm believer that learning doesn't stop after school, and I've spent my lifetime learning and loving the thrill of diving deeper into the topics that fascinate me. That's why I love the Great Courses Plus, Real Crime Scenes, The Evidence Speaks. And I have to say, even for a seasoned prosecutor like me, it was fascinating to hear them talk about all of the techniques they're using right now in DNA, fingerprint processing, blood analysis. It's good to find out what's real, what's not, and how it really works. So this is the perfect course to get you started with the Great Courses Plus. Or you can choose another of their more than 10,000 lectures. With the Great Courses Plus, you'll get unlimited access to stream this and their entire library of courses. Learn from leading professors and experts about any topic that interests you: history, psychology, literature, science, even hobbies like writing and photography. You can watch or listen at any time and from anywhere. I want you to enjoy the thrill of learning from the Great Courses Plus too. So I've arranged a special limited time offer for my listeners, a full free month of unlimited access to enjoy any of their lectures. But to start your free month, you have to go to my special URL at thegreatcoursesplus.com/MCI. That's thegreatcoursesplus.com/MCI. And we're back with Marcia Clark Investigates the First 48, the podcast. So here's the thing. Since the fake account was in Levin's name, he'd be able to take credit for the profits. So when Joe's account turned a profit of almost $9 million, Ron Levin was able to show the account records to a different brokerage firm to persuade them to give him a line of credit. And it worked. He got a $1 million line of credit. So the fake account was a win-win. The brokerage firm looked like it had made a lot of money, and Ron Levin was able to get a line of credit. Joe, of course, didn't know that. He believed the money was real, and he asked Levin for his share of the profits. But Levin stalled until a few weeks later, purely by accident, Joe found out from an employee at the brokerage firm that the money was fake.
So he called the broker at the brokerage company and he said, I haven't been able to get a hold of Ron Levin and he owes me half of this $8 million. And the guy said, well, you know that it was a sample account, it wasn't a real account. And Joe, without skipping a beat, oh yeah, I knew that. And then got off the phone with him and he was livid.
Oh yeah.
And telling Ben Dostey and Dean Carney, which was his lieutenants, I guess you'd say, I'm going to kill him. I'm going to get Ron Levin.
Humiliated and furious, Joe told the BBC about Levin's scam. Joe and the BBC's bodyguard, Jim Pittman, visited Levin at home. The next day, Joe brought a $1.5 million check drawn on Levin's Swiss bank account to the BBC's office. Joe thought he'd bought himself some time with his investors, but when he tried to cash the check, it bounced.
What I learned is that he only had $86 in that account, I guess enough to keep it open.
The next morning, 19-year-old Dean Factor and Michael Broder went to Levin's apartment to pick him up for a planned trip to New York. They knocked, but no one answered. Then they noticed that the burglar alarm was disarmed. That was strange. Levin always activated the alarm when he was in for the night or when he left the apartment. Two other of Levin's friends found Factor and Broder sitting on the steps. They were confused too. It wasn't like Ron Levin to just disappear like that. Soon after, Levin's housekeeper arrived. She let them in. Levin wasn't there. But there were signs something was amiss. Levin had a small black bag of personal items he always took with him when he left the apartment. It was still there. The white comforter he always had on his bed was gone, replaced with a green blanket that was reserved for guests. The remote control for the television, which was always on the bed or nightstand, was missing too. Levin's housekeeper found 2 salads sitting on the table, which made her think someone had been with Levin the night before.
And the dog was in the house, which the housekeeper thought was kind of odd that the dog was in the house alone without Ron Levin.
Because he didn't leave the dog by himself?
No, he idolized that dog.
Wow. And all of Ron's clothes were in his closet. If he'd left town, he'd have packed at least some of them. An even more ominous sign. Ron Levin was very close to his mother. They spoke every day. When Ron's friends called to find out what she knew, she said she had no idea where he was. His mother tried to make a missing persons report, but the Beverly Hills Police Department said she had to wait 48 hours because Levin was an adult. Levin's friends drove to the Beverly Hills Police Department and told detectives they thought Levin had been murdered. But the detectives were skeptical. Levin had been on their radar for years because of all the scams he'd pulled. Around that same time, Joe Hunt hinted to some of the BBC members that he'd taken revenge against Ron Levin for scamming him. In a taped conference, Joe told all 70 of his remaining investors that he'd lost all of their money. But he was more explicit with his best friend, Dean Carney. He actually told Carney that he and Jim Pittman had killed Ron Levin. The police were now attempting to determine exactly what had happened to Ron Levin.
When the missing person report came in, I looked at it and I basically said to myself, boy, it looks like somebody, caught up with Ron Levin.
By July, Joe was desperately in need of money. About a month after Ron Levin's disappearance, BBC member Ben Dostie introduced Joe to Reza Eslamania. Reza bragged that his father, Hidayat Eslamania, whom he hated and from whom he was estranged, had over $30 million. Reza had good reason to think his father had money. He had a house in the uber-wealthy community of Hillsborough and an apartment nearby. And he'd amassed millions when he was a high-ranking official with the Shah in Iran. But when the Shah was deposed, Hidayat was forced to flee to the United States with his family. His assets were frozen. Nobody in the family could access the money. But Joe Hunt, along with Ben Dostie, Dean Carney, Jim Pittman, and Reza Eslamania, believed they had a way to get Hidayat's money. They'd kidnap and torture Hidayat until he relented and signed over his accounts to them. $30 million would more than solve all their money problems. They might have gotten away with the kidnapping if they hadn't screwed up so badly in their effort to get the money. Because when Hidayat Eslamania disappeared, most people thought he'd been kidnapped or murdered by someone affiliated with the Ayatollah. Hidayat had been working closely with the State Department in the United States to help overthrow the Ayatollah. So no one was really suspicious of Joe Hunt or the BBC. But 7 days after Hidayat Eslamania went missing, his son Reza tried to get into his apartment to look through his papers and figure out how to get the money. However, Hidayat's girlfriend, Olga, refused to give Reza access to the apartment. The BBC persisted in their efforts to get Hidayat's money. The BBC got their lawyer, Jerry Eisenberg, to fly up to the Bay Area to meet with the FBI. They hoped the FBI would help Reza get Hidayat's papers, but the local police said that a court would have to sign off first. So the BBC lawyer, Eisenberg, flew back to Los Angeles to wait for the court to rule. Eisenberg visited the BBC offices, and there he ran into bodyguard Jim Pittman. For some reason, Jim decided to tell Eisenberg what actually had happened to Hidayat Eslamania. He told the lawyer that Hidayat was dead, that the BBC had kidnapped him and accidentally killed him. Eisenberg immediately contacted the FBI and told them about Pittman's confession. As the FBI was getting the real story about what had happened to Hidayat Eslamania, the Beverly Hills police were learning the truth about what had happened to Ron Levin. Brothers David and Tom May told Beverly Hills detective Les Zoller that after Joe found out how Ron Levin had scammed him, he and Jim Pittman had gotten rid of Levin.
Joe's plan was to knock on the door. Ron Levin would let him come in. Joe brought a couple of salads for dinner. And then after a little while, Jim Pittman, the bodyguard of the Billionaire Boys Club, he would knock on the door And then as soon as Jim got into the house, basically pulled a gun on Joe Hunt, saying that you borrowed money from unsavory characters that want their money back. And Joe said, well, I'm trying to get the money, but I can't get it back from Ron Levin. So that was the plan, the way Joe set it up. And then they typed out the check for $1.5 million, which was from a Swiss bank account. And Ron, without any qualms, signed the check. So it actually went pretty easy. And once that was done, they had Ron Levin in the master bedroom, laying on the bed with Pittman, and I guess the high sign was made by Joe, and Jim shot Ron Levin in the back of the head.
The police got a warrant to search Levin's apartment.
And Ron Levin's father was there, Martin Levin, and there was a closet that was turned into like a secretariat area. And he went into this closet and pulled out this yellow legal paper, and it was folded in the middle, and he handed it to me. And I opened it, and it was actually had a title, Things to Do at Ron's. And it had things like close blinds, set alarm.
Tape mouth, kill dog.
It was interesting because in the margin, Joe Hunt had signed it. He had practiced signing his name a couple of times. And, I immediately saw that it was a recipe for a murder. It was things to do at a murder scene.
This list was law enforcement's dynamite. It was a virtual confession to Ron Levin's murder. Joe Hunt was finally arrested. He agreed to talk to Detective Zoller, but when Detective Zoller showed him the to-do list, Joe said he wanted a lawyer. In the meantime, Risa Eslamenia was still trying to get his hands on his father's money. Risa forged a power of attorney in an effort to withdraw $100,000 from Hidayat's Swiss bank account. But the bank was suspicious. They called Hidayat's best friend. The friend called a special agent with the state attorney general's office. The agent realized that it was a fake. But the whole story about what really happened to Hidayat Eslamenia wouldn't be revealed until the police got to the person closest to Joe, his best friend, Dean Carney. And because he had the key evidence, he got the deal of the century: full immunity for all crimes committed in exchange for his testimony. The plan was both elaborate and absurd.
For what I can remember, it was Joe Hunt, Dean Carney, Ben Dostie, Reza Eslamenia, Jim Pittman.
They'd driven up to the Bay Area, rented a U-Haul, and purchased UPS uniforms. Then, posing as UPS delivery men and carrying a large trunk, Joe, Jim, Carney, and Dostie got Hidayat to let them into the apartment. Risa waited in the car. Once inside the apartment, they used chloroform to subdue Hidayat and stuffed him into the trunk. They carried the trunk out to the U-Haul and drove off. The plan was to drive to a remote location where they would torture Hidayat and force him to sign over his assets. But the plan went hideously awry.
Well, as they're driving down, Hidayat starts waking up from the chloroform, and he starts yelling and screaming, and Joe said to Dean, check on him. So Dean checks on him and tells him to be quiet.
They'd poked air holes in the trunk, but Hidayat was screaming so loudly they were afraid someone would hear him, so they taped over the air holes. By the time they reached the site where they'd planned to torture him, Hidayat Eslamenia was dead. He'd suffocated. Panicked, Joe and Dean Carney dumped the body in a ravine in Soledad Canyon.
And as they're driving up from Soledad Canyon on this fire road, Joe makes a statement to Dean, this is where we buried Ron Levin, way up on the top.
And I'll tell you, it's a vast expanse of desert, with hills and deep ravines that stretch for miles. If you didn't know where to look, you'd never find anything.
Within a couple of days, Dean Carney took us up to the area and pointed out the valley that they dumped Hidayat Eslamenia in. And we went down this culvert and started looking, and we found the remains of Hidayat Eslamenia.
The DA's office in the Bay Area filed a case, and the murder of Hedayat Eslamania was added to Joe Hunt's charges. The case, Joe Hunt, and the BBC became a media sensation. I remember it because at the time, I was a baby DA, and it was a very big deal. Ben Dosti and Riza Eslamania would eventually also be charged with Hedayat's murder, and they, as well as Joe Hunt, would stand trial for it. But that comes later. First up, the trial of Joe Hunt and Jim Pittman for the murder of Ron Levin. It was one of the most challenging kinds of murder cases there is, because Ron Levin's body had never been recovered, although investigators had searched Soledad Canyon where they believed Levin's body had been dumped. In a murder case, one of the key pieces of evidence is the body itself. Without it, the prosecution's burden is doubled, because not only are they missing a critical source of information, the victim's body, they also have to prove that the victim is really dead. And in this case, that was harder than usual. Ron Levin had a 12-count fraud case with a potentially lengthy sentence hanging over his head. He had ample motive to flee and go into hiding. Over the course of the 5-month trial, the prosecution called 62 witnesses, including several BBC members, to support their theory that Joe meticulously planned Ron Levin's murder, both to infuse cash into the failing BBC and to retaliate against Levin for conning him. The most important witness, though, was Dean Carney. He was the last to take the stand. He gave a detailed account of the meeting during which Joe told BBC members how he and Jim Pittman had killed Levin and forced him to sign the $1.5 million check. And then, of course, there was the final coup de grace, the 7-page murder to-do list. After deliberating for 2 days, Joe Hunt was convicted of murdering Ron Levin. It was a death penalty case, but the jury voted to impose the sentence of life without the possibility of parole. When the judge pronounced sentence, he smiled. He told Joe life in prison would be a greater punishment for him than the death penalty. The case against bodyguard Jim Pittman was a whole different story, though. The jury loved him. He was tried twice for his part in Levin's murder. Both trials ended in a hung jury. Rather than try him a third time, the prosecutor offered Jim a deal. Jim Pittman pled guilty to being an accessory to murder after the fact and felony possession of a concealed weapon. Pittman had been in prison for over 3 years. By the time he was sentenced, he was released with credit for time served. But that's not the end of the story. Joe Hunt, Jim Pittman, Ben Dosti, and Riza Eslamania still had to stand trial for the murder of Hedayat Eslamania. Riza Eslamania and Ben Dosti were the first to be tried. The trial took place in the Bay Area in San Mateo Superior Court. Once again, Dean Carney was the star witness for the prosecution. He described how the 5 of them had kidnapped and killed Hedayat to get his fortune and funnel it into the BBC. Carney told the jurors that Riza hated his father. He told how their plan to torture Eslamania in a safe house had inadvertently ended in his death. Riza said he didn't know anything about Hedayat's kidnapping until later, when Joe Hunt told him his father was dead. He claimed that he'd then tried to get access to his father's assets because Joe Hunt had threatened to kill him if he didn't. Dosti claimed he didn't know about the kidnapping plot and was asleep in a motel. The jury didn't buy either story. Both Riza and Ben Dosti were convicted of Hedayat's murder and sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. Next, it was Joe's turn to stand trial. He'd been unhappy with his lawyers in the Levin trial, so this time around, though he had no formal legal training, he decided to represent himself. But this was not a nobody case. There was no denying that Hedayat Eslamania was dead. So Joe took a different tack. He pinned the entire murder on Dean Carney, the best friend who'd betrayed him. It was really the predictable thing to do. Blame the snitch and point out that the snitch only got immunity because he said what the prosecution wanted to hear. After deliberating for 26 days, the count 8-4 for acquittal. It was a shocking verdict. Afterward, some of the jurors said Hunt was one of the most effective defense attorneys they'd ever seen. Aware that their chances with Jim Pittman were slim if they couldn't even convince a jury to convict the mastermind, Joe Hunt, prosecutors dropped the Hedayat Eslamania charges against Jim Pittman. Then, in yet another bizarre twist, 10 years after Riza and Ben Dosti had been convicted of Hedayat's murder, their convictions were overturned. A damning tape of a police interview with Riza's brother, which had never been allowed into evidence, had been mistakenly sent into the jury room during deliberations. The court reversed the convictions against Dosti and Riza and granted them a new trial. Rather than go back to trial and risk a conviction, Ben Dosti took a deal. He pled guilty to manslaughter and kidnapping, and he got freed with credit for time served. But Risa refused to plead guilty. He insisted on going back to trial. Though it seemed like a foolishly risky choice, and one I have no doubt his lawyers were unhappy with, it turned out to be the best decision, because when it came time to go to trial, the prosecutor said they were unable to divulge information about Dean Carney's whereabouts in the last 10 years. He'd gone into the witness protection plan. This meant the defense would not be able to meaningfully cross-examine Carney about what he'd done in the past 10 years, so the judge dismissed the charges. Risa went free. So ultimately, although Dosti pled guilty to manslaughter, no one was ever convicted of murder for the killing of Hidayat Islaminiya. Today, Joe Hunt is the only member of the BBC still incarcerated, and he's still attempting to appeal his conviction for the murder of Ron Levin. I investigated the Billionaire Boys Club case on my TV show, Marcia Clark Investigates the First 48. So tune in and watch. It airs tonight at 9 p.m. Eastern and Pacific Standard and 8 p.m. Central on A&E, or find it online at aetv.com. And now we're going to go to the mailbag to answer your questions on last week's show, the murder of Jam Master Jay. We're going to start with voicemails.
Hi, Marcia. My name is Amy, and I was wondering if there was any truth to the fact that Jam Master Jay was heavily in debt when he was murdered.
Hi, Amy, and thanks for your question. According to the investigative journalist Frank Owen, who looked into the matter, there was some indication that Jam Master Jay may well have owed back taxes to the IRS, a substantial amount.
Hi, Marcia. This is Colleen calling from Connecticut. I'm just wondering if anyone outside of the 4 people in the room saw the 2 men. Isn't it possible that that story was made up and that one of the people in the room actually shot him? And the second part is, were any of the people in the room tested for gunshot residue on their hands?
A number of you actually sent in emails asking that same question. As far as I know, everyone who was in the studio that night was ruled out, and I believe was tested for gunshot residue as well.
So, this week's mailbag, your listeners are all over this. Melinda is a music supervisor, so she's got a special area of interest here. Why wasn't the theory that Jay had a recording of an unreleased artist the motive? Did somebody know about a hidden artist recording that he had? And
there's no evidence that there's an unreleased recording.
A lot of your listeners had this question. Was there any DNA collected at the crime scene that maybe they couldn't do something with then, but maybe now?
You know, I don't know the answer to that question. I do know that they collected shell casings, of course.
Right.
How much DNA swabbing was done, I don't know, but the casings would still be in evidence, and the casings would still be available for swabbing. I'm sure that they will re-examine them in the course of their investigation, as I understand that they have reconvened a grand jury.
Okay. Now, this person, an aspiring Crown attorney, she wants to know if it was possible to identify what types of guns are consistent with gunpowder.
I don't know that gunshot residue is all that particular to a gun. It's particular to certain kind of bullet, and they never did recover a murder weapon.
Really?
And they would have done that by matching to the casings.
A lot of people had this question too, among them Paige and Bill. They just want to know why Lydia wasn't squeezed like a juice box to get all the info out of her. Although I'm going to add my own. Pretty Tony knew too. I mean, it seems like everybody knew, and I kind of felt bad for Lydia. Like everybody's like, Lydia, you do it, you do it, you do it, you do it. And, other people know what's going on.
I agree with you. There's no way, in my opinion, that Pretty Tony's story holds up, that he had dropped his cell phone and he was reaching down for it when these 2 guys walked in and shot Jay. And the problem is the police did squeeze both Lydia and Pretty Tony. The reason we keep coming back to Lydia is at one point she said she was willing to cooperate if they would protect her, but they wouldn't offer her the level of protection she needed, and so she fled.
Now, I'm going to ask you to speculate, and I know how much you love that. Do you think, just for chat purposes, it just seems to me that sort of everybody knew what was going on? Did you get that sense?
I got the sense that people were talking like that.
Okay.
I got the sense that there was a lot of talk on the street about we all know who did it, we all know, but nobody's saying any names.
Got you.
And it's really easy to say, I know, but you're not saying who and how you know and where you got that from. So I don't know how much anybody
really knows about what
Right.
happened and who did it.
Right, just how much is gossip that you kind of pass on like knowledge.
All right, thanks, Epi. That's our mailbag.
And I invite you to call in and ask questions. I've set up a hotline. Just call 402-882-6474. That's 4028-VANISH. V as in Victor, ANISH. Or you can email us at marciaclarkpodcast@aenetworks.com.
Thanks so much for your questions. They've all been terrific. Come back and listen to the mailbag episode for all the questions we couldn't get to.
And you can just ask us questions in general. I don't feel like I need to be an authority on everything to have an opinion. So just if you think that you want me to take a whack at something, let us know. And perhaps Marcia will give you some legal advice, too, if you're into that.
No.
She will not do that.
No.
Marcia Clark Investigates the First 48, the podcast. Hosted by Marcia Clark. Produced by Emil Klein and Chelsea Great. Research by Robin Kiyomi. Supervising producer is Scott Brody. Executive producers are Marcia Clark, Ted Butler, and Peter Tarshis. Music is by Blake Maples.
Special thanks to Rob Wood, Greensman. Wait, we shoot in a booth. There isn't even a green wall.
We're distributed by Audioboom. The TV series Marcia Clark Investigates the First 48 is produced by ITV and airs at 9 p.m. Thursdays on A&E. Find out more at aetv.com.
But hang on. Any information, communications, or material you submit to the Marcia Clark Investigates the First 48 podcast by email, download, telephone, or otherwise is non-confidential, and AETN is free to use and reproduce such submission freely and for any purpose. Please see the site for complete submission terms.